My son said the divorce was my fault while his dad cheated 4 times. His sister asked him one question at the engagement dinner that he couldn't answer. I met Conrad in college. We were both engineering students, both plain looking, both happy with that. We got married after graduation, and for 10 years he loved me exactly the way I was. Then Conrad decided to go to law school and everything changed. He got tailored suits and designer watches and joined a gym and went from a soft frame to a lean one in 8 months. I was raising our 2 children, Hugo and Luz, handling 95% of the household and working full-time. I did not glow up. I didn't have the hours or the energy because I was keeping our family running while Conrad studied for the bar. After he started practicing law, Conrad had affairs, at least 4 that I know of. When I pushed for counseling, he told the therapist the problem was my appearance. He said my nose was too big and my stomach had never recovered from 2 pregnancies. The pregnancies that gave him his children. He listed them in front of a professional like he was returning a defective product. I was getting ready to file for divorce when Luz was hit by a car while riding her bike. She was 9 years old. She survived, but she needed 3 surgeries and 2 years of intensive rehab. Conrad and I agreed to stay married for the kids during Luz's recovery. He kept seeing other women. I stopped caring because I had a daughter learning to walk again, and a son who needed stability, and a house to run by myself. Conrad walked in and out like a guest at a hotel. He came home for dinner sometimes. He didn't come home other times. He stopped explaining either way. I learned not to ask. Asking was its own kind of humiliation. I drove Luz to physical therapy at 6 in the morning before work, and at 7 in the evening after work. And on Saturdays, I sat in waiting rooms with a stack of paperwork from the office because I couldn't afford to fall behind. Conrad was at the gym. Conrad was at the firm. Conrad was at a dinner I wasn't invited to. We separated after Luz went to college. The divorce was final 2 years ago. Conrad is now remarried to a woman named Bianca, who is 33 years old. In the past 2 years, I finally started focusing on myself. I colored my hair. I lost 15 pounds. I updated my wardrobe. I started dating. Not because Conrad told me to, but because for the first time in 20 years, I had the time and the freedom to care about myself. My children hate it. Hugo told me last Thanksgiving that the divorce was my fault. He said if I had put in the effort to match Conrad, none of this would have happened. He said I was too selfish and lazy to glow up when it mattered, and now I was doing it for strangers. He said watching me date proved I was capable of trying all along, and I just chose not to. He said he was getting married in June, and he was too angry to invite me. Luz was sitting right there. She didn't say anything that night. She just looked at her plate and let Hugo finish. I didn't argue with him. I didn't defend myself. I sat at that table while my own son told me my marriage failed because I didn't get a facelift, and I cleared the plates, and I drove home, and I lay in bed staring at the ceiling for 3 hours, and I didn't cry. I had nothing left to cry with. 3 weeks later was Hugo's engagement dinner. He invited Conrad and Bianca. He invited Luz. He invited his fiancée Renata's family. He did not invite me. Luz called me the morning of the dinner and said I want you to know what happens tonight. She went. She sat next to Hugo. She waited until the appetizers were cleared, and Conrad was telling a story about the firm, and everyone was comfortable. Then Luz said, Hugo, I want to ask you something. Hugo said sure. Luz said, do you know why mom and dad really divorced? Hugo said because mom let herself go and dad moved on. Simple as that. Luz said that's what dad told you. Hugo said that's what happened. Luz said no. What happened is dad had 4 affairs that we know about. The first one started when I was 3. Mom found out and asked for counseling, and dad told the therapist the problem was mom's nose and her stomach. He said those things sitting next to her in a room with a professional. Hugo looked at Conrad. Conrad was looking at his wine glass. Luz said mom was getting ready to file for divorce when I got hit by the car. She stayed married to dad for 6 more years so I could have both parents in the house while I was learning to walk again. Dad kept cheating the entire time. Mom knew and she stayed anyway because she didn't want me to go through rehab in a broken home. Hugo said I didn't know that. Luz said I know you didn't. Because dad never told you and mom never used it against him because she was too busy making sure we were okay. Mom didn't glow up because she was working full time and raising us alone and running every part of the household while dad was getting fitted for suits and going to the gym and sleeping with other women. She didn't have time to glow up. She didn't have the money to glow up. And she didn't have a partner who helped her with anything because her partner was too busy becoming someone who was embarrassed to be seen with her. Hugo was quiet. Renata put her hand over her mouth. Bianca was staring at the tablecloth. Conrad said, Luz, that's enough. Luz said, no, it isn't. She looked at Hugo and said, you uninvited the woman who spent 6 years in a miserable marriage so I could learn to walk again. You told her she was selfish for not getting a makeover while she was driving me to physical therapy 3 times a week and helping me with homework from a hospital bed. And now she finally has time to take care of herself, and you're angry about it. You're angry that she's doing at 52 what she couldn't do at 35 because she was too busy doing everything for us. Hugo didn't say anything. He looked at Conrad. Conrad was cutting a piece of bread slowly with his knife and not eating it. Renata leaned over and whispered something to Hugo. Hugo pushed back his chair and stood outside the restaurant for 10 minutes. When he came back in, he sat down and said, I need to call mom. Luz said, yes, you do. Conrad said, I think we should all just move forward. Luz said, we are moving forward, just not in the direction you were hoping for. Hugo called me that night. I almost didn't pick up. My hands were shaking, but not from fear. From 20 years of silence finally meaning something. He started slow. He said he didn't know about the affairs. I asked him what your dad told you happened. He said Conrad told him I stopped caring about the marriage, that I let things fall apart, that Conrad tried and I wouldn't change. He said it like a memorized script. I told him about the therapy session. I told him your father sat in a room with a licensed professional and told that therapist the problem with our marriage was my nose and my stomach. I told him about the night I found the second affair, sitting in the car in the driveway for an hour because my hands wouldn't work. I couldn't go back inside and look at him. I couldn't drive anywhere because my hands wouldn't grip the wheel. I sat in the dark and shook. I told him about the suitcase I had packed the week the hospital called about loose, clothes folded, apartment saved on my phone, my finger an inch away from the call button on the divorce attorney's number when the phone rang in my hand, and a nurse said your daughter has been hit by a car. He went very quiet. Then he said, why didn't you ever tell me any of this? I said because you were a child, then a teenager, then a grown man who had already decided I was the problem. He said I want to fix this, and I felt the pull, the old familiar pull that lives in every mother's chest. therapist. The one that makes you want to smooth it over and tell your kid not to worry. I had said versions of it's okay 1,000 times in my life. To Hugo when he was small, to Luce when she was scared, to Conrad when I should have been screaming at him. I almost said it again. I didn't. I said fixing this isn't a phone call. You repeated your father's words to my face. You uninvited me from your dinner. You sit with that. Then he said Dad called me on the way home. He said you exaggerated. He said you're rewriting history because you're bitter. Conrad was already working before Hugo even got home from the restaurant. That is what Conrad does. He doesn't fight the truth head on. He talks around it until it sounds like something else. I told Hugo to believe what he saw at the table. His father couldn't look anyone in the eye. He stared at his wine. He cut bread he didn't eat. He told Luce to stop talking. That isn't what innocent looks like. The line went quiet. I knew this wasn't over. I had one thing Conrad didn't expect. I still had the therapist's session notes from our couples counseling. I had requested copies before Luce's accident when I was first preparing to file. I had never shown them to anyone. The next morning, I pulled the box down from the closet shelf. The notes were dated and printed on official letterhead. The summary from the March session listed Conrad's complaints in clinical language. My nose, my stomach, my postpartum body. All of it written down by a professional who had witnessed him say it while I sat next to him. I texted Hugo and asked to meet for coffee. He said okay, but he wanted to bring Renata. I said that was fine. Renata had been at the dinner. She had no history with me. She was a witness who only knew what she saw. And of it, Saturday morning my phone rang while I was getting ready. It was Conrad. He hadn't called me directly in months. I picked up. He said I don't know what you and Luce are doing, but you need to stop filling Hugo's head with this garbage. His voice was sharp, like a lawyer talking to someone he thought was beneath him. I leaned against the bathroom counter. I said, which part is garbage? The 4 affairs, or the part where you told a therapist my nose was too big? He went silent for 3 full seconds. I counted them. Then he said we were both unhappy. I said I was unhappy because you were sleeping with other women. That's not the same thing. He said if you keep pushing this, you're going to lose Hugo for good. I said you've been making sure of that for years. He hung up. At the coffee shop, Hugo was already there with Renata. He didn't stand. He didn't hug me. He said I'm here. Renata reached over and squeezed my hand. I told Hugo I wasn't there to make him pick a side. I was there because he deserved the truth. He said Dad says you're trying to turn me against him. I didn't argue. I pulled the file from my bag and set it on the table. I said these are the notes from our couple sessions. I didn't write them. The therapist did. Read the session from March. He didn't pick it up right away. Then he did. Renata leaned in to read with him. I watched his face. It changed slow. The line where the therapist noted that Conrad identified his wife's physical appearance as the primary source of marital dissatisfaction, specifically referencing her nose and postpartum body changes. Clinical words for an ugly thing. Hugo set the paper down. He said he actually said this to a therapist. His voice was smaller. His phone rang. Conrad. He didn't answer. Then it buzzed 3 times in a row. Texts. Hugo flipped the phone over. His face shifted. That small crack of belief that had been forming, I could see it closing. He said Dad is saying you forged these documents. He's saying you're manipulating me. I felt the ground tilt under me. Conrad wasn't even in the room and he was still controlling the conversation, texting his son in real time while his son sat across from me reading the proof, trying to make the evidence itself into a lie. I kept my voice steady. I said those notes have the therapist's letterhead, the date, and the session number. You can call the office Monday morning and verify them yourself. If your dad is saying I forged them, then he's saying I faked official documents from a therapist's office. Ask yourself if that makes more sense than what's on the paper. He pushed back from the table. He said I have a wedding in 5 weeks and my parents are asking me to pick a side and I can't think straight. Renata put her hand on his arm. I said I'm not asking you to pick a side today. I'm asking you to read those notes when you're ready and decide for yourself what kind of man would say those things about the mother of his children. Hugo picked up the file. He said I'll read them. He didn't hug me. He walked out. Renata followed but looked back at me for a second on the way to the door. I sat at that corner table by myself with cold coffee I had never touched. I texted Luce that he had taken the file but Conrad was texting him in real time. Luce wrote back 2 minutes later. She said Dad called me too. He told me I ruined the engagement dinner and I should be ashamed of myself. I read it 3 times. Conrad had called his own daughter, the one hit by a car at 9, the one who learned to walk again while he was out having affairs, and told her she should be ashamed for telling the truth. He was in panic mode. A man in panic mode makes mistakes. 3 days later, my phone rang from a number I didn't recognize. It was Renata. She said I read those notes after Hugo fell asleep. I read every page. I need you to know I believe you. I sat down on the couch and cried. She said Hugo believes you too. He just doesn't know how to say it because admitting his dad lied means admitting he hurt you for no reason. He's not ready to face that, but I'm working on him. She also told me Hugo hadn't spoken to Conrad since the coffee shop. Not a call, not a text. Conrad had been reaching out. Hugo wasn't responding. That meant something. Hugo had never gone silent on his father. Not during the divorce. Not after Thanksgiving. Conrad was the version of a man Hugo wanted to be. The suits, the career, the confidence. And now for the first time in his adult life, Hugo wasn't picking up the phone. The therapy notes did what my words alone couldn't. They put it on paper with a date and a letterhead and made it impossible to explain away. A week later, Luce called. She said Hugo had texted her and they had talked for an hour. He didn't apologize. Not yet. But he asked questions. Real ones. He asked her how long she had known about the affairs. She told him since she was 14. She had found a text on Conrad's phone when he left it on the counter. He asked why she never told him. She said because you worshipped Dad, and I was scared you'd hate me for ruining that. 2 weeks before the wedding, I was making dinner when the doorbell rang. Hugo was on my front porch, alone, with the therapy file in his hand. He came in and sat down at the dining table, the same table where I had helped Luce with homework during rehab when she could barely hold a pencil. He said I called the therapist's office. They confirmed the records are real. Every page. I nodded. He said I called Dad and asked him about the session. Dad said the therapist misunderstood, that he was talking about how stress was affecting both of you physically, that the therapist wrote it down wrong. He looked at me. He said that's a lie, isn't it? I said what do you think? He said I think Dad has been lying to me for a long time. The room was quiet. Then he asked the harder question. He said why did you stay married to him after Luce got hurt? I said your sister was 9 years old and learning to walk again. She needed both parents in the house. I made the choice to stay in a marriage that was killing me so my daughter could heal real. And your father kept cheating the entire time I did it. Hugo put his head in his hands. He pressed his palms against his eyes and just sat there. His shoulders were moving. Not crying exactly, but close. Something shaking loose that had been locked down a long time. He said, I told you it was your fault. At Thanksgiving. In front of Luce. I said yes. You did. He said I repeated what Dad told me like it was fact and I never once asked you for your side. I said no, you didn't. He looked at me and his eyes were full. He said, Mom, I'm sorry. 2 years. I had waited 2 years to hear those words from my son. I didn't rush to make him feel better. I let the apology sit in the air between us. I let it have weight. Then I said, I will forgive you because you're my son and I love you. But the way you spoke to me at Thanksgiving, the things you said about my body, those words came from your father's mouth, but they came out of yours. That's something you need to carry. He nodded. He said, I want you at the wedding. I need you there. I said I need to think about it. His face changed. Not angry. Surprised. He hadn't considered that sorry might not flip a switch. I wasn't being cruel. I was being honest. Going to that wedding meant walking into a room with Conrad in it, Bianca in it. I needed to decide if I was ready. Hugo stood up. He said, whatever you decide, I understand. Then he left. I decided to go. Not because Hugo asked, but because I was done hiding. Luce came over the morning of the wedding with a dress bag. She had picked it out herself. A deep green dress. Simple but sharp. I put it on and looked in the mirror, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't see the woman Conrad left. I saw the woman who survived him. When I walked into the reception hall, Hugo crossed the room in 5 seconds. He hugged me in front of everyone. The first time in 2 years he had put his arms around me where other people could see. Conrad was sitting at a table 30 feet away. His face was completely still. The ceremony was beautiful. Renata glowed. Hugo cried during his vows and looked out at the second row and mouthed, thank you. Luce squeezed my fingers. After the ceremony, the photographer set up for family photos. Hugo found me and said, Mom, you're in the first round. Conrad stepped forward and said, I think we should do parents of the groom together. His voice was casual, like a suggestion. I knew the play. He wanted one united family photo, so the version of the story he had told for years stayed intact on camera. Hugo looked at his father and said, we will, but Mom goes first. Conrad's expression flickered. Half a second. I saw it. Bianca put her hand on his arm. The camera flashed with my son's arm around my shoulder and Renata leaning in. I did not look at Conrad. I had spent 20 years looking at Conrad. That was over. At dinner, Hugo stood up and tapped his glass. The room went quiet. He thanked Renata's family. He thanked his friends. Then his voice changed. He said, I want to say something about my mom. I saw Conrad straighten across the room, both hands flat on the table. Hugo said my mom spent most of my life putting everyone ahead of herself. She worked full-time, raised me and my sister mostly alone, and held our family together during the hardest years of our lives. When my sister was hurt, my mom put her entire life on hold so Luce could recover. She drove to physical therapy 3 times a week. She slept in hospital chairs. She did all of it without complaining and without asking for anything in return. He paused. He took a breath. His hand was shaking a little where he was holding the glass. He said, I didn't understand what that cost her until recently. I said some things to my mom that I'm ashamed of. I repeated words that weren't true because I didn't bother to ask her for her side of the story. I won't make that mistake again. He raised his glass. To my mom, the strongest person I know. Glasses lifted around the room. Luce was crying next to me. Renata was crying. I sat very still. Conrad was holding his glass, but he had not raised it. His jaw was tight. Bianca was looking down at the tablecloth. The toast didn't say Conrad's name. Hugo didn't accuse him of anything. He didn't have to. Every person in that room heard the words mostly alone and words that weren't true. They could do the math. Conrad set his glass down without drinking. His son had just stood in a room full of people and quietly chosen his mother's truth over his father's story. After the toast, I needed air. I walked out a side door to a small garden behind the venue. String lights over a stone path. White flowers I didn't know the name of. I closed my eyes and breathed. Then I heard the door open behind me. After 20 years of marriage, you don't forget the sound of someone's footsteps. Conrad stopped a few feet away. He said, you got what you wanted. His voice was flat. I said what I wanted was to be invited to my son's wedding without having to fight for it. He didn't respond right away. Then he said I wasn't a good husband. I looked at him. The man I married when we were both young and plain and happy. The man who changed into someone I didn't recognize and then punished me for not changing with him. The man who cheated on me 4 times and told a therapist my nose was too big and let me raise our children alone while he built a life I wasn't invited into. The man who spent years telling our son the divorce was my fault until our son believed it. In 20 years, this was the closest he had ever come to admitting it. I said, no, you weren't. He nodded. He said I told Hugo what I told him because it was easier than telling him the truth about me. I said I know, because I did know. He didn't poison Hugo against me because he hated me. He did it because the truth about who he was and what he did was so ugly he couldn't stand for his son to see it. Conrad looked at the ground. Then he said, almost softly, like it surprised him, Luce looks just like you did in college. Then he turned and walked back inside. I stayed in the garden. The lights kept swaying. I went home before the cake was cut.